Welcome to Leadership Where It Matters Most. The family is the most important institution in the world. The future of the church passes through the family. The church has the greatest mission of any organization ever. Go and make disciples of all nations. The family and the church. This is where leadership matters most. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into Leadership Where It Matters Most. Today's guest is Dr. Brett Salkeld. Brett is the Archdiocesan Theologian for the Archdiocese of Regina, Saskatchewan. He earned his PhD in Systematic Theology from Regis College at the Toronto School of Theology, and he has a bachelor's degree in education from the University of Regina, where he studied to become a social studies and math teacher. He has worked with graduate and undergraduate education students and with Catholic teachers in various professional development settings. He currently resides in Regina with his wife Flannery and their 7 children. And today, Dr. Salkeld and I speak about his book called Educating for Eternity, a teacher's companion for making every class Catholic. So Brett and I have a really wonderful conversation, mostly about the themes in his book. He does share with us a little bit about his testimony, communicates why he decided to study theology, kind of what prompted him to write the book that he wrote. And then I've got just a number of chapters and particular insights that I wanted to explore with him. So we have a good bantering back and forth. And then, of course, Brett, as with all guests, tells us where we can find him online. So enjoy the episode. Dr. Brett Salkeld, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's great to be here, Brett Powell.
Did I announce that properly?
Yeah,
Enunciate it?
There you go. Well, we accept a bit of a range of pronunciation when you have a name spelled like mine, and you were well within range.
Good. Thank you for that. We don't have to stop and re-record. Brett, I just want to give you an opportunity, maybe for those listeners who aren't as familiar with you as they should be, just tell us a little bit about your story. How did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, so I grew up in small town Saskatchewan. I always like to represent St. Wenceslas Parish in Gerald, Saskatchewan. Came to the University of Regina to become a teacher. I loved my high school history class, and my high school history teacher thought I'd be a history teacher. Where I grew up, there weren't Catholic schools. When I got to the U of R, I could do my internships in Catholic schools, and then I learned that you could be a theology teacher or religion or Catholic studies teacher. They keep changing the names of it. And then partway through my history degree, my history professors suggested I look at grad school. And I was writing all my papers on church history. And so I looked at grad school in church history and found out that that was taught in theology faculties more often than it was taught in history faculties. So I applied to a few theology schools and got into a couple. I went to Toronto. And in my first semester there, everyone has to take the same intro courses: intro scripture, intro ethics, intro theology. I was signing up for classes for the next semester, and I was looking at the catalog, and there was a whole bunch of courses that were like all the things I always wanted to study. And I went to sign up for them, and they said, well, you can't take those classes. And I said, why not? And they said, well, because you're a history person. And I said, well, who gets to take those? And they said, people in systematics, which I had like barely even heard of.
Right.
And I was like, well, how do I go into systematics? And they're like, well, go down to the registrar's office and check a different box. I was like, okay, I'll do that. So theology is always what I was looking for. And in my undergrad, history is where I found a place to do some theology. But when I found like theology proper, systematic theology, I was like, and my mom was like, yeah, when you were little, you used to come home from catechism class and like walk in circles around the kitchen table and talk to yourself. So I was sort of built for those kinds of questions. I got a master's and a doctorate in theology, but always was interested in education. My first degree was in education. I started working with Catholic teachers while I was doing my doctorate. I was teaching, they call them AQ courses, additional qualification courses for Catholic teachers in Ontario, where I was studying in grad school. And then I came out to Vancouver, where you are, for a year. I taught at St. Mark's College. I was a scholar in residence there for a year, and a big part of my student body that I worked with were Catholic teachers who were doing a master's degree in religious education. Did work for several years with Newman Theological College they have a satellite program here in Saskatchewan, first as an instructor and then as director for several years, working with teachers doing a master's in religious education. taught a course at Campion College here in Regina for aspiring Catholic teachers. And that's what really launched the book that we're talking about here. I went down to the school board's office and said, if you were hiring students who had one class in Catholic education. Now, I've since come to say, we need a college in Western Canada that will give students 4 years in Catholic education, and then let's hire them in our Catholic schools. But at the time, I said, if you could, have students who took just one course in 4 years in Catholic education, what would you want them to study? And they said curriculum permeation, curriculum permeation, curriculum permeation. And I didn't know what that was. And they said, well, it's teaching every subject from a Catholic point of view. So a Catholic school isn't just a public school with a cross and a religion class and a couple of liturgies a year, but it should shape your whole approach to all of life and learning. How do you think about everything from a Catholic point of view? I said, well, that's fascinating. I think that's a great idea. I'd love to learn more. Is there a textbook I might use or something to teach the class? And they were like, yeah, there's not really anything. Mm-hmm. So I had to figure it out in sort of real time with my students. And that was the beginning of this journey here, where that eventually turned into a book, which has seemed to have landed in a place where a lot of people were waiting for a book like that. Catholic educators across North America and probably beyond have been saying we need to think about, I think as the default settings in the culture get less and less in common with the Catholic worldview, we're more and more aware that we need to be intentional about a Catholic worldview and what that means for what we're doing in math class, which seems odd to people, but there's this hunger that's been out there, and the book seems to have landed into a place where people are like, yeah, this is what we've been waiting for.
That's awesome. You've already introduced a lot of the themes. So, I mean, you published a book, I think it was 2023, just, a short while ago.
Right.
Obviously, you wrote it prior to that. And would you say this was the catalyst more about your interest in this topic, or was it the felt need that you kind of began to hint at, like, hey, if I was to teach, or if there was a course, what would it be? Or if there was a textbook, what would it be? And they're like, yeah, that doesn't exist.
Right.
So is it your interest or the need that you saw?
Yeah, it was really both. After I taught this course at Campion, a group of Catholic teachers from Regina Catholic schools came up to me. It wasn't the school board. It wasn't their employer saying, come do professional development. It was a group of teachers who said, we're being asked to do this. We have no training in our undergrad to do it. We don't have professional development to support us in doing it. We think it's a good idea. We don't know what it means in practice. And so the first work I did outside of the course I taught was at my local parish. I did talks on like Tuesday nights with 10 to 20 people would show up, local Catholic teachers who wanted to do this. And so their need, that need was manifested. They said, we want to do this. And their employer was saying, yeah, this is a priority. But I just found it fascinating. Once I started digging into the material, the work I did with those teachers was, the first 2 nights were more general faith and reason, that kind of thing. But then we did nights on specific topics, like a math and science night. What does that look like? And doing the work of thinking about literature or math from a Catholic point of view, I just found it fascinating and so interesting. And so there was both this need that was manifested by the school board asking me to teach this, by these teachers asking me to do some professional development, even outside of their, paid commitment. And so, yeah, it was really both. I never would have stumbled across this work myself if others hadn't said, hey, we need support here. So that was manifest to me. But as soon as I started, I had always dreamed actually of writing a book that was like 50 things Catholic teachers should know, just because some false narratives about the church or about history or about whatever that they're going to face on the front lines in the classroom. So I had this sense of but this gave it a much deeper grounding. It wasn't just a random collection of facts like, hey, we should know the real story about Galileo rather than the false one, right? But this was this required a much more theoretical foundation for thinking through. So the book starts with part 1 is joy and virtue, faith and reason, truth and freedom, some really foundational categories. And then part 2 is well, what does that mean in math class? What does that mean in health class? What does that mean in social studies? So I just feel really blessed that the pieces all came together the way they did. And they sort of came together on the Canadian prairie in a small center that very few people, where I'm traveling, people like, Regina, where's that? And I was not plugged into the larger discourse around these questions. I wasn't going to conferences. I wasn't teaching in an education faculty. Like it was really an interesting combination of circumstances that the Holy Spirit used to produce this work, which I love, but which I never would have thought of myself.
Right. Yeah. I want to actually read a quote, and it's from the foreword that was given by Thomas Carroll to the book. I'm just going to grab my book here because I really want to read it. So Thomas Carroll, for those who don't know, he's the superintendent of schools for the Archdiocese of Boston. And I wanted to read this part because he references a book that I often am promoting and talk about, which is From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. So this is Thomas Carroll. This is what he wrote in the foreword for your book, Educating for Eternity. In the seminal book, From Christendom to Apostolic Mission, Monsignor James Shea describes the shift from Christendom, a culture that was largely defined by Christianity, to a new apostolic age in which we must go forth like the original apostles and make our case to a broader community of non-believers. As superintendent of schools for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston, I believe Catholic schools properly organized are the only way we can rebuild our church and religious belief in America. In this context, he says, Educating for Eternity, your book, will become the indispensable handbook for a renewed apostolic effort to salvage our culture and church by helping teachers and leaders find their school's Catholic voice. Because of the influence of Educating for Eternity, countless children will be set on a path to eternal salvation, and the church itself may be given new life as well. Now, there's a lot there. That's high praise from, a significant voice in Catholic education.
Right.
Now, there's a couple of things I want to ask you about from that quote. First of all, I'm curious from your vantage point as the author, how much of this shift from Christendom to Apostolic Mission was factored into writing it? And secondly, has it been all praise from the Catholic education space, or has there been some constructive or some criticism, some voices of criticism?
Yeah.
Curious.
Okay. Yeah. Let's take them in order. Yeah. So Monsignor Shea actually blurbed my book, like not on the back of the book, but on Amazon. And a lot of people have seen his book and mine as really complementary sort of works. Read them in either order. You'll see a lot of commonality of approach. And I think it's because we both live and work and pay attention to a culture where Christian sort of presuppositions are sort of rapidly disappearing. And that can be scary in a way, but it's an opportunity for a fresh chance at articulating something that people have almost forgotten, and it gives us a chance to present the Christian message in new and interesting and compelling ways. And I mean, we're seeing interesting shifts as the culture becomes less and less Christian. We're seeing a kind of gap in people's search for meaning, their possibilities for meaning. Sometimes those are filled with kind of political radicalism on left or right. I think that's an ersatz religion. I think it looks remarkably like not like authentic religion. It looks like the religion that the new atheists think Christianity is. Actually, that those critiques can be applied to political extremism, left or right. And so a compelling presentation of the Christian message is actually finding interesting places to land as people are sort of looking, because the basic human questions don't change. People have the same basic needs, the same desires, the same hopes and dreams that humans have always had. And Christianity provides I think the most compelling answer to those questions. And now they get to be seen in a new light instead of being like the default setting that we're trying to rebel against, that gets tied up with the old guard and whatever we don't like about the old guard, right? So it's an interesting opportunity. And it grew out of my work with teachers who live in that place. Like that's the front line, is teachers are encountering students who have like no Christian imagination. And in fact, many teachers who want to work in Catholic schools and have a sense of basic goodwill towards the church and towards the sense of Christian mission themselves we failed them in forming their own Catholic imagination. And what I find in my work is the vast majority of these teachers are people of goodwill who, when you pitch the Christian message in a way that lands on their questions, they're like, oh, there's so much more here than I guessed. And they're
Yeah,
like
right.
pleasantly surprised they might be pleasantly surprised that the most common and a little stronger response I get is like, why has no one told us this before? If I'm talking about sex, if I'm talking about sacraments, if I'm talking about scripture, doesn't matter. Like any topic, very, very common response is, why hasn't anyone told us this before? And so I think that book you mentioned, Christendom to Apostolic Mission, and my book both come out of the same context. And Monsignor Shea and I have, of course, different vantage points from our different positions and personalities and gifts, but in some sense, a pretty common vantage point on that. So maybe that's an answer to your first question. Your second question about Thomas Carroll's language there is, it's almost embarrassing for me to sit and listen to you read that.
I saw you squirming as I was reading it.
It's a little overwhelming. I hope it does a fraction of what he hopes it can do, but it's what I want it to do. I mean, this is why you write a book like this. I wouldn't say there's been much critique. I mean, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. What there are practical questions about what does this mean. And the book is practical in a certain sense because it gets us thinking about our subjects from a Catholic point of view in a really practical way. But it's not a book about lesson planning. It's not a book about classroom management. It's not like, there are practical things that still need attending to. So one question I get is about the practicalities. Another one is there's some really basic questions, and it's not necessarily from people who've read the book, because I think the book mostly answers this. But when I go talk to groups, most of them haven't read the book. And I'm keenly aware that there are legitimate questions about this approach. And in my like keynote addresses and stuff, I want to tackle them head on. So one really common, well, there's really two. One is, are you trying to turn every class into theology class? And you want to reassure people, like, the different disciplines have their rightful place in methodology. And science, for example, science questions deserve science answers. We're not trying to replace the appropriate methodology of science. You can say that about any of the subjects. But you are trying to recognize that science questions and science answers don't happen in a vacuum. Why they matter and what they mean for human life and flourishing and the human vocation in creation are big picture questions that matter. And they're not in competition with legitimate scientific questions. In fact, they make the practice of science itself more interesting and more compelling and more meaningful, right? So you have to differentiate and kind of stay in your lane, but you also have to recognize the big picture. So one is methodological independence, and teachers who are subject area specialists who've been working in this area for years, they deserve to be reassured that we're not coming for their expertise. Like, no, that's valuable and we want that there. And then the second one is like, how do we do this in a way that doesn't feel artificial, that doesn't feel like tacked on? Because a lot of times people have been asked to do this, but without having been given the theoretical foundations, they can find ways to stick the Catholic on somewhere. And sometimes the results are not compelling. And if the teacher themselves does not feel like this integration is authentic, you can guarantee the students are going to pick up on that. And then it starts to smell a little like indoctrination. And then it's going to create a backlash in your audience. And like I tell teachers, like, if a student pushes back against something that feels artificial, good. Then they're paying attention. Like, we want students who don't go along with something that's not authentic and integrated. And so the challenge that student presents with us is a challenge we should welcome and accept, because we should be able to do this in a more integrated and authentic way. And that's the kind of work I want to do with teachers. And that's why we can't start at the lesson planning stage. We have to start at like, how do faith and reason relate? And then we're going to think about what that means for this subject. And then we're going to think about like photosynthesis or whatever the particular topic is, right?
Right. So just for people that are listening, the way that you've structured the book, there's part one, part two. Part two is sort of the specifics around particular subjects, literature and language arts, history, math, science, etc. The first part is that theoretical or that sort of just fundamental beginning. What are people for? It's where you speak about joy and virtue, truth and freedom, faith and reason, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you dropped a term earlier, Brett, which I want to circle back to because I think it's really important for people to understand this. to understand the whole book as well as everything with Catholic education. And that is curriculum permeation, or I think another term that you use is Catholic academic integration. So why don't you just tell us what that means?
Yeah. So people use different terms. Curriculum permeation is relatively common in Canada. Catholic academic integration, they use it at the McGrath Center at Notre Dame, and it's getting some currency. But other places will say, like, infuse your lessons with Catholic worldview or with faith, or, there's a bunch of different ways to say this. But the basic idea is your approach to your subject matter isn't neutral. It's not neutral now. It's impossible to be neutral. Like 2 plus 2 is going to be 4, whether you affirm the resurrection or not. But what it means or why it matters that 2 plus 2 is 4, and why you should care and why you should learn these things and how you might apply them in your life, those things don't admit of neutral answers. And so if you aren't explicit and intentional about a Catholic worldview, some other worldview is there, influencing, on display, more or less explicit, more or less intentional, but you can't avoid it. And even something like telling students, like, well, you get to make your own answer to that question, right? There's no like, you can't access a true answer about this, but what you can do is like make your own meaning and find your own answer to this. That pretends to be like not an answer, but it's a very bold statement about the world and about the human person, about your capacity for truth. And in fact, it's a pretty unsatisfying one. We actually see, I would suggest, in the mental health crisis among young people, we see part of this cashing out, this sense that you make your own rules, you make your own beliefs, you make your own. And the problem is, if truth is inaccessible or doesn't even exist, or it's just a power game, or however you want to articulate it, then whatever answer you come up to with these questions that you were supposed to sort of assert yourself on the universe, you know that they're arbitrary. And that's not what you're built for. You're not built for asserting an arbitrary answer and then like staking your claim there. And so what you see instead is like boredom and anxiety, because people want to encounter reality. They don't want to make it up and know they could have made something else up that would have been equally valid. If they're all equally valid, then none of them are valid.
Yeah, right.
You can see how something like Catholic academic integration or curriculum permeation isn't just tacking Catholic stuff onto math or literature class. It's rethinking the foundation of why we're educating and what a human person is and what they're for. That will inform what we do in math and why we do it. And it's not about, two nuns were driving from Montana to Saskatchewan and they were doing 80 miles an hour, but when they crossed the border, it was kilometers.
Yeah.
There's all these jokes about these arbitrary Catholic word problems, because that's all people can imagine in math class if they think it's about adding like Catholic content. But it's actually about rethinking what we're doing and why we do it. And sometimes there's subjects where there's great Catholic content. Art and literature and history and social studies, there's just a ton of Catholic stuff. We're not exclusivists. We're going to study great literature whether a Catholic wrote it or not, because we think humans pursue goodness and truth and beauty, and doggone it, sometimes they find it. And when they do, that's worth engaging. Even when they're wrong, they can be darn interesting, can't they? Because the pursuit of truth is a worthy thing to do, right? But when there's things like math or science where the Catholic content piece is not obvious, people kind of say, well, maybe this is an exception to the rule. And it's like, no, we need to go back to basics. Why do we do what we do? What does this mean about the human person and our vocation? And then you can literally teach anything from a Catholic point of view without it being arbitrary and imposed, right?
Yeah. It was interesting because I remember reading about the insights that you were giving with postmodernity and relativism and all that, and how it's a very, almost unkind way of presenting what seems to be an empowering thing to students, that you can be and think anything you want, your truth and all this. And what I find interesting is that you layer on top of that kind of the what's seen as like the primary virtue of our day is advocacy. But these kids are being encouraged to advocate for something they found out about yesterday. Like it's not lasting. It's like vapor. It's a mist. And then all of a sudden they realize the week later, oh, I wasn't right about that.
Right.
It's just so unkind. But so much of the first part of your book is really just about a good, solid anthropology,
Right.
understanding what human beings are for. So maybe even just speak more to that from a Catholic perspective, because that's where you can, when you have that as the foundation, which is why I'm sure you wrote it in the way that you did or structured your book in the way that you did, then you can have the freedom. It's like learning the piano, Well, as soon as you know that you have the discipline down, you can get so creative with different things. As soon as you have that discipline down of Christian anthropology, that we're made for God, by God, then you can have the freedom to get in all these other disciplines.
That's exactly right. When the highest goods are recognized as the highest goods, then all the subordinate goods find their rightful place, right? So when human life and education, as preparation for that life and as part of that life, is ordered towards the highest good, then the subordinate goods, life in the political community, a job that you can support your family, hobbies and interests that make life worth living, all those subordinate goods find their rightful place. But when any of those things are made to stand in for the highest good, they will inevitably falter, right? And we can see this, the different gods we worship, we worship health, right?
Hmm.
What do we say when someone has a child, right? It doesn't matter if it's a boy or girl as long as it's
Just as
healthy,
it's healthy. Yeah.
right? Now, I will take health for your child and for mine, given the choice, of course, right? But like as a god, like you're going to sacrifice at that altar, and it's going to get you, like,
Yeah.
right? And you need something more lasting than health, for example. But you could say that about 25 other things that we're tempted to worship, whether it's money or prestige, or you mentioned advocacy, right? Being on the right side, right? Virtue signaling, that doesn't last. And we're literally seeing this crumble. If you look socially and culturally and politically, we're seeing the inability of sort of political virtue signaling to provide deep meaning. And it happens in two ways. You chase it more and more, so you get more and more extreme. That's one way that you can see it's failing. It works almost like an addiction, like you need the more extreme version of it. Or then you hit rock bottom, if to continue the addiction metaphor, and you're like, this isn't working.
Yeah.
This is so ideological, it doesn't actually relate to my reality. And so I've had it and I'm tapping out. And so then you might find something else that offers more meaning. You might find, authentic religion, or you might numb yourself with video games and porn, or
Yeah.
or whatever is on offer in the culture, right? But these are all functions of just getting your priorities wrong. Like all these other things are genuinely good, right? Political action is good, but like trust not in princes. Like that will not give you the life that you were made for. Physical intimacy is good, but like you can chase that for a long time and find out you're not a happy person, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about is like when you talk about the highest good and then those that are lesser good subordinate to that. I mean, really, that's another way of understanding the virtue of justice, everything right ordered. And again, here we have this encouragement for social justice, political justice, whatever, human justice. And it's like, it's all really good, but man, you could just get so far in the periphery and then you lose yourself without that proper understanding of the highest good and then the things that are goods but subordinate to that.
Right. I'm watching Atlanta. Have you seen this show on Disney Plus, Atlanta?
No,
Donald Glover.
no, I haven't.
I shouldn't talk about this too much, but we just watched an episode last night. You don't watch it with the little kids. We watch it with our oldest child and my wife and I. But it's African American show, Donald Glover and his co-stars and co-producers. But a major theme in the show is like they mock white liberals
Hmm.
for thinking that black people are super fragile, for problematizing all kinds of basic human interactions that are really normal by overlaying them with politics and ideology. It's fascinating to watch because these people aren't like conservatives who are trying to like, there's this awkward sort of way that like, I don't know, that certain conservative outlets try to be as funny as the liberal outlets, and it doesn't really work. But this is not that. This is like, it's the people who were supposed to believe and say all the things that you're supposed to say and believe, saying like, this is a little silly, and it's not actually real life. And it's quite brilliant. I mean, it's rough around the edges, and I'm noticing this more and more in art. that there's ways in which the mainstream narrative is being questioned in really interesting ways.
Fascinating. Okay, I want to say a few things that I read in your book and get you to expound on them a little bit. So, one of the things you wrote, a Catholic education seeks to form the student into someone who can live well. I thought education was about transference of knowledge or the formation of skills for the job market.
Right.
What do you say about that?
Right. Well, I mean, I think if you ask the person on the street, why should kids go to school? They're going to talk about skills and knowledge for some global marketplace, right? I mean, that's, and then think about what the implication of that is for students, right? So the bulk of your life is dedicated to economic preparation. So what kind of a thing are you? What are you for? What's your life all about? Well, I guess basically I'm a widget, right? I'm a cog in an economic machine. I may be more or less successful at that, but that's the kind of thing I am, right? And if you say instead, like, there are a whole bunch of factors that go into a life well lived, and being able to provide for yourself and your family is one of those things, but it's far from the only thing that makes your life worthwhile. And we want to think about living well, growing in virtue, living in healthy relationships, developing good habits. And here's the thing. All the economic stuff, seek ye first the kingdom and the rest will be added to you. People who from their education learn how to, like, I don't know, monitor their own sort of relationships and behaviors and encounters with the rest of reality, including other people, and, like, do the good that they see and know that they want to do and have the discipline to do it. Those are not people who have trouble getting jobs. Like, these things are not in a zero-sum game, but if we form people for virtue and the building of good habits and good relationships, and if that is prioritized in a Catholic education, yeah, we're going to get plenty of engineers and accountants and doctors and teachers and all the things that we need in our society. Like, we're not going to lose that because people are like, oh, I'm focused on virtue, so I don't know how to do math. Like, that's just not how it works.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what you're saying obviously is consistent with the greater view or methodology of a simple liberal arts education. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, liberal arts, I mean, the etymology is like liberal. These are the freeing arts. These are the things that make you able to live a fully human life, right? People use different language, and sometimes liberal arts can get, like, associated with a certain movement that some people are on board with and some people aren't. And so, you don't need to die on the hill of terminology, but the basic idea of a liberal arts education is that this is about the formation of a human person. This is not about the equipping of a widget for a task in an economy, right?
Yeah. Another quote. You said, "Our desires have more weight than our thoughts." What do you mean by that? And why is that important for Catholic educators to keep in mind in the classroom?
We think of education as teaching people what to think, even though all the time we say, don't teach people what to think, teach them how to think. And when we say that, we're telling people what to think. Like, we can't help ourselves. We're always telling people what to think because our basic conception of education is that the human person is kind of an empty vessel that needs information. And you talked about advocacy earlier. I mean, so much of education now is like getting you on the right side of the right social issues. That's what we do here. And what we find in our experience of ourselves and our life is, like, we might think any number of things and have a really hard time actually acting on those things, right? And this is what St. Paul talks about, like, wretch that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I know certain things and I believe certain things, and I find myself unable to do the good I want to do. And the Christian tradition has said, well, it's because your desires are at war with your thoughts, and you need to integrate that to figure out what's going on. And if we overlook desire, the connection between our thoughts and our behaviors is going to confuse us. But if we're like, oh, actually, I'm pursuing some good, I may be pursuing it in a confused and disordered way, but I'm actually chasing something. What is that thing, and how can I authentically encounter it? And how do I shape my desires? Because modern society imagines desires just emerge ex nihilo. Like you just out of nowhere, you have certain desires, and a happy person is the person who manages to sort of satisfy the desires that we can give no account of. Like they just emerge, right?
Yeah.
And no, that's not how desires work at all. Like desires are totally socially conditioned. That's part of what the doctrine of original sin says is like you watch what people around you value and what they pursue and you're shaped in that. And so this is what we do in parenting, this is what we do in families, this is what we like even something like worship is a practice of desire structuring.
Mm.
Like go and listen to this story and affirm this good and right say that you're God and I'm not. Like all of these practices are a way of forming this. Singing good music, even it's like something that basic. And when we educate, like we're really in the business of educating desires because desires will shape your life more than almost anything else. And they don't come out of nowhere and they're not immutable. They're not under direct control. This is why we think they're immutable. They're not under direct control, they're under indirect control. This is why the church has talked forever about things like avoiding occasions of sin. Because when you're in a certain context, certain things are unavoidable. But you get to choose things about your context and you get to choose things about your worldview by practicing, thinking true things. With the most successful psychological school today, I mean, I'm not the expert in this, but from what I can gather, is cognitive behavioral therapy. And what does it say? Your mental health is largely in jeopardy because you believe and repeat to yourself false things.
Mm.
So find out what the true thing is and repeat that to yourself instead, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is not surprising according to a Christian worldview that would actually work, right? But it comes back to this sense of like, you can have control over these things in an indirect way if you take the big picture. And an education is largely about that big picture worldview formation. What is true and how do I encounter that? I'm made for encounter with beauty and truth and goodness. I desire those things. You know the line, what's the line? Even the man who knocks on the door of a brothel is looking for God, right? Like our desires are oriented towards the genuine good, even if they can get sidetracked. So if we don't see that part of the human person, all the right thinking that we can put in people's heads is going to have quite minimal impact if it's not integrated with our desires. And we're going to be a mystery. We're going to continue to be a mystery to ourselves because the thing I think I believe, I'm usually not able to act on.
Yeah. It's fascinating, Brett, because right before you said that, I wrote down Chesterton. Every man that knocks on the door of the brothel desires God.
Okay.
That's funny how that works. But one of the reasons why I thought about writing that down, from my experience, both my own educational journey, as well as knowing a lot of teachers, knowing a lot of inspiring teachers, I think the really good teachers are the ones who are not scandalized when the obvious manifestation of human desire is taking place in the classroom, and maybe they're saying and doing things that aren't perfectly aligned to the moral teaching of the church. But there's something good about authentically exploring desire itself, because desire is not an unholy thing. It's not
Right.
unholy for me to desire, if you will, intimacy with my wife. That's right ordered. There's something beautiful. It leads us to God. But it's like, again, it comes back to that Christian anthropology, that understanding that it's not about like getting kids to follow a certain narrow way, although of course we want them to follow the narrow way. But it's like we can have the freedom to explore these things when we understand the human person,
Right.
and not
Right.
be scandalized by it.
World religions and philosophies have had to deal with the question of desire. And there's one way to deal with it is like desire is going to cause you a lot of pain and suffering. If you follow these desires, you're going to get yourself in trouble. And so the practice is to extinguish desire. If you move past desire, then you move past suffering. That's one answer to that question. And I'm sure there's wisdom to be found in sort of learning to moderate certain kinds of desire, right? I have no doubt that there's wisdom in some of those traditions. But the Christian tradition has gone in a way in the very opposite direction. It doubles down on desire. It's like you're a desiring creature. You're made for God. Don't settle for less than the highest good. Like double down on desire. And so Yeah, you have a desire for physical intimacy with your wife, and that's a good thing. But notice that that thing, when satisfied, does not answer your life's question. Even that thing, which seems, in some moments at least overwhelming, is only a pointer to something else, right? And the encounter with all kinds of things in this world, like the best meal you ever ate, the most beautiful sunset you ever saw, the best lovemaking with your wife you ever had, whatever it is, in the end, you're like, can I die happy now? Is that the whole thing? Is that my life's, or am I still desiring something even more than that? And Christianity has said, yeah, like you're made for infinity. You're made for God and all these other goods which are wonderful, but they're not ends in themselves. They point beyond themselves.
One of the things you talk about, I'm kind of all over the place, but I want to just give you an opportunity to speak to this. But human beings are meaning makers. We are built with a desire to know the truth. How does that factor into this idea that it's not just about teaching people how to think, it is teaching them what to think?
Yeah, I mean, you teach people what to think sort of one way or the other. Now, the truth behind this idea that you shouldn't teach people what to think is people need to be able to discover the truth, right? Truth imposed is less satisfying than truth discovered, right?
Yes.
So that's the real thing that makes this idea that you shouldn't teach people what to think appealing. But the point is, you're going to teach them what to think one way or the other. So let's be honest that we're making a genuine proposal about the world, but let's put that before you as something you can discover and not just an answer that you already know before you take the test. It's a proposition, not an imposition. You set someone up for an encounter with truth, but only they can, in their own proper subjectivity, know and affirm the true and the good. Yeah, so we don't impose teaching what to think in that sense. Imposing, that's a false way of doing it. But proposing and letting the encounter with reality shape you, you're going to learn what to think and how to think simultaneously. Like they're not opposed operations, right? They like the encounter with reality needs both because there's the objective reality that's outside of yourself and there's the subjective reality that you're always the one encountering
Right.
the
Yep.
reality. And a certain attitude towards education might emphasize the subjective to the point where the objective gets lost, and then the subjective has nowhere to go. It's just sort of floating aimlessly. But you can also make the reverse error. You can overrule people's subjectivity and just sort of impose the data of reality in a way that they're not free to encounter. And that's not education either, right? And so we want to do both of those things in a way that encourages freedom and responsibility.
Love it. That's great. That's just such a good image of an excellent educator, is to hold that space, that tension between the two. That's brilliant. So, Brett, like we kind of talked about the structure of the book. We've been dealing a lot with kind of the foundation, part one. Part two, it kind of goes by subject and that kind of thing. My wife's favorite chapter is on health. And one of the things you say, which I want to ask you about, you say health is a great good, but a terrible God.
Right.
Just as an example of something to riff on a little bit in terms of the specifics of subject matter, what would you say about that?
Since I wrote the book, I've started calling this zooming out. The content in health, right? Smoking, your relationship with substances, your relationship with technology, your relationship with sleep, your relationship with exercise, all these sorts of things are the content of health. And they are what they are, whether you affirm the resurrection or not. But what they mean, right? So what's the value of health in human life? How often do we ask that question in health class? I mean, we presume that health is a great good, and it is. Health is a great good. It's worth a lot of your time and effort. But we have to be able to think about what a good life is when you don't have the full blessing of health. And if the implicit answer, the implied answer in Canada, with more and more every day as assisted suicide marches
Yeah.
on,
Yeah.
is that your life is worth less when you don't have that full blessing of health. And maybe it's time to just wrap things up here, because why linger on when you're not healthy? Well, what does that say to like anybody? Because who's going to have the full blessing of health all the time? Like all of us are going to face health problems. And so in addition to teaching kids in a health class what are good life choices and good habits related to your health, because health is a great good, I think we also need to ask big picture questions about what does it mean to live without the full blessing of health? And how do we find meaning in that life? And can we live well without it? And we need models for that. We need, I think of the end of John Paul II's pontificate. One of the things he was doing for us was modeling that your life still matters when your health is like literally crippling, right? Whatever vocation, he happens to be Pope, but it wouldn't matter. Whatever your vocation is, you can still serve God and make a difference in the world with or without the full blessing of health. Like sometimes I'm thinking families who've seen a good death, who've seen some of the best living people do is with a terminal diagnosis. And to ignore that reality, to ignore that some of the best living you've done or seen done, right? If you've watched a family member die well, and if you've watched what happens to the relationships around that person as they die well, that tells you something about what kind of a good health is and what kind of a good it isn't. And
Right.
it's not a good that fully determines your value. That's for darn sure, right? And we just, in a culture that, this is a great example of the culture's presuppositions around this are just the opposite of a Catholic presupposition, but they're not neutral. So when we intentionally bring a Catholic presupposition to these questions, we're not imposing something on the subject matter that doesn't fit. You might even argue that the other view that is becoming the sort of cultural standard is an imposition on the subject matter that doesn't fit, that in fact makes human life less livable. So this is not an imposition to ask these bigger picture questions, and we can actually give kids something that's going to make their life more meaningful, make more sense, put it in a bigger picture. The question of God and suffering, I mean, that's a massive question for philosophy, but it shows up in health class, right? And the cross is a great place to look to say, yeah, suffering is not meaningless, or it doesn't have to be. It can be offered for a greater good. We're not so limited as free and responsible people that we can't make some offering of this that builds up life in human community, right? And Jesus shows us that on the cross.
Yeah, of course. One of the things that I was thinking, just as you were talking about suffering and suffering done well and how inspiring that is, you talk about inspiration, how important that is in the classroom and all that. But even like I had the great opportunity, Brett, to watch my father-in-law love his wife who was suffering from progressive aphasia, which was later diagnosed with dementia and then, pretty severe dementia for a long time. And I mean, he was a living catechism of love. And there was something just so inspiring about watching what humanity lived well does with suffering in that environment. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. So, anyways, yeah, very, 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 very moving. So, I want to just talk about a couple more things because we got to tie this up. But I'm curious. I mean, you've been on kind of on the road a little bit now, Brett, with the book and interacting with different audiences, all that. Like, based on sort of the conversations you've had and what seems to be sticking with audiences, and maybe is there areas in the book that you would have maybe in hindsight's 2020 like enhanced a little bit more or addressed further or even omitted? Maybe is there anything come to mind?
Well, I mean, the first and most obvious thing is I only wrote 8 chapters in part 2, and there's 8 more that should have been written. There's no
Right.
chapter on business, on psychology, on computer science, on music, on world languages. We need to do all that work, and I want to do that work. I got to find time because I'm on the road all the time, so my
Yeah.
writing is not flourishing right now. One thing that I've developed in workshops that if there was a second edition of the book, you would work it in, is a series of questions that help people articulate their own vision of their subject area, their discipline that they're responsible for teaching. What does it mean that the human person engages in this activity?
Mm.
The fact that human beings do math, what does that mean about us and about math and about the universe we find ourselves in? And so I do this work with teachers where I lead them through a series of sort of guided questions. One is about the human person, one is about God and creation, and one is about ethics or values
Mm.
that help them to start articulating their own sense of the theoretical foundation for why they teach what they teach, right? And then we walk through what does that look like in practical terms when I have to teach a lesson on fractions or on this poem or this short story or this health, item, whatever it is, right? So I'd like to do something that offers those steps to teachers and helps them think those through. And I need to learn more. I've been challenged actually. So my theological locus for the book, like the central doctrine for the book, is the doctrine of creation. I wouldn't have even said that when I was writing it, but it's become clear to me after the fact that the doctrine of creation is my central locus. And I've been challenged by a few people to say, what about the doctrine of redemption? They haven't said it explicitly. It's come out a little bit, here and there. But I'm recognizing that I could have thought more. So, for example, I got a question about teaching art. We're teaching art, and lots of the artists whose art we study were not great role models. How do you deal with that? How do you teach kids about beautiful and great art that comes from broken people? And I was like, okay, there's doctrine of redemption, right? There is like, God doesn't give up on people who make bad decisions, people who come from bad situations, broken relationships, whatever else. There's still people like you and me who are pursuing that good that God put in our hearts. And sometimes the most beautiful expression of that, the most poignant expression of that, can come from the person who sees most clearly how they're missing it. That was an advance for me from this doctrine of creation, which is great. I'm all for the doctrine of creation, to being able also to incorporate the doctrine of redemption in thinking about our subjects. I had an interesting conversation with people about teaching business and the doctrine of redemption in business. I can't even remember the details, but there's something about business where there's this like regular exposure to failure,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
business. That was something. And what we said about art. And so I want to explore, that kind of thing, because I think there's the questions and ideas I've come up with so far are good, but I don't think they're the whole thing. Like I think we need more people doing this work. Like I'm happy to be out here and I'm happy to be like in demand, so to speak, but I also want to like equip and lift up more voices because first of all, there's just no shortage of work. Like the harvest is plentiful, but also because we need more points of view and conversation and learning from each other and that kind of thing. So I'm working towards those kinds of goals as well, is building up a community that does this together where I'm one voice, but I'm not the only thing going.
Right. When you talk about like, okay, so the evolution into redemption, like one of the things that's presented as an idea in, again, from Christendom to Apostolic Mission is this notion that one of the grave negative consequences of the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century, is like you can point to a lot of different things that came in at that time, but what Monsignor Shea would say is the elimination of the doctrine of the fall is so consequential. When you have no fallen humanity, you need no savior kind of idea. So when you talk about redemption, is it first acknowledging the reality of our wounded fallen nature, or is it just the positive, the redemption story and that kind of thing?
Right. That's good. So I need to think more about that, right? But I mean, one of the things that comes to mind as you articulate that is like, what has this sense that I'm okay, you're okay, done to people's encounter with themselves and reality? I don't think that people are happier. They know that they're not okay. And now we have these other phrases, right? So 30 years ago, 40, we said, I'm okay, you're okay. And now we've changed it to, it's okay not to be okay. Like,
Right.
well,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
what are we doing? Like, we're trying to recover a doctrine of original sin or the fall in some like sideways way that acknowledges the brokenness. We thought of the fall, or well, not we, but like the rejection of the fall was based on this premise that it's like this negative attitude towards the human person that is sort of crippling and denigrating, instead of like, no, it's just a reflection on our own experience that helps us make sense of who we are and gives us a starting place for thinking about how we might address this problem, right? And so we've replaced a lot of our theological language with like therapeutic and psychological language because the human problem is still the same. Now the question is, does the therapeutic language, does it work? Does it do the job? Does it, and not saying, that the theological language was always perfect in every case, and we never had any difficulties either. But I think it's worth exploring the intersection there. So yeah, I want to think more about what are our limitations, what does our brokenness teach us in our engagement with reality generally, but maybe it's with a particular subject you study. I mean, health, obviously. And I mean, health is a great example because in health, we see this thing that shows up in the rest of life, which is some of the things are your fault and some of them are not.
Right.
And it's really tempting to like whitewash that and make everything that bad happens to you your fault, right? That's the temptation of Job's friends.
Yep.
Right? Or the flip side is to excuse everything. And like neither of those are going to work. So, I mean, health is a neat metaphor for life overall, where, yeah, things happen from outside of you. And original sin, I mean, this is the thing about original sin. It's not your fault, actually. But you're in a situation where you have to take some responsibility. And even when we're addressing historical injustice, this is another place where you have the same pattern where it's like, okay, we are all responsible for where we are and for right relationships where we live now, which is not the same as saying that you're responsible for something that someone who's long dead did. Like walking that line and being able to articulate that is important. So I wonder, I'm just riffing now, but I'm wondering if this is a place where history, health, where this sense of brokenness comes into play as part of the doctrine of redemption, is an acknowledgement of that kind of brokenness, right?
Yeah, fascinating. This is all stuff maybe that's on your horizon. We'll see.
I love thinking when people throw me questions, and it's it's baby steps at the beginning, but it might lead to something more. You never know.
I mean, one of the things you talked about is this idea maybe of workshops really helping educators kind of master the fundamentals in their discipline. You talk about how there's another 8 chapters that could have been written. What's most important for you in the future? What's on your horizon? What's coming up?
2025 is booking up fast for speaking. A big thing is figuring out balance there. Like, speaking is great. I love it. I think it's valuable. I think it helps the mission. There's a limit to how much you can do. And so finding other venues for exploring this. I'm building an online community that I hope will be able to help my partners in places where I've spoken, but also in places where I haven't, to continue doing this work, both with me, but also with each other. Some more collaborative work. I'm hoping to put together a book of sample lesson plans where I'm not the person who writes them, where I work with teachers who are good at this, who submit lesson plans or unit plans in different subject areas at different grade levels, to give people some pictures of this. I have ideas for future things I'd like to write. I don't know when I'm going to get time to write them, but the ideas are emerging. I've just started a new podcast, the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. The first episode is out now. Archbishop Miller is my second guest. His episode will come out in early January. Yeah, so there's lots going on. Right now I'm kind of just trying to stay on my surfboard on the wave with the speaking, and I don't know how long that lasts, but it's sort of, both my wife and my bishop have said a new book is not new forever. So do what you can while you can, and then we'll figure it out. But it's pretty open-ended. Like, there's a lot of possibilities. I want to find more and more collaborators. I'm slightly nervous that I said something earlier that may have given the impression that there aren't collaborators already. There are people doing good work in this thing, but a lot of what's going on is people don't know about each other. And my work started in a silo, and now I'm encountering more and more people, and I think other people are encountering me, and I want to help them encounter each other. So maybe that's a vague answer, but there's a lot going on. I'm developing some e-courses, which is a way to do a flexible way to do some professional development with teachers. So I'm hoping that is something that's going to be helpful for people. We'll see. We're at this stage with my family and with my work where it's like we do a reassess every 6 months, and we just say, like, how's this going? How feasible is this? How sustainable is this? So far, so good, but yeah, there's a lot of things happening.
Yeah, I'm sure. But that's great. That means there's a lot of opportunities. So, and I hope that the right ones come to bear. Where can people find you online? What's the best place to contact you?
Yeah, I'm all over the place, but I finally have a home base online, which is makingeveryclasscatholic.com. So if you're interested in this work, that's the place to go to find out about the community, the e-courses, the speaking, all that kind of stuff. I have a Facebook group for Catholic educators called Making Every Class Catholic. I'm on YouTube and Substack, and not super active on Twitter, but I'm on there. LinkedIn, if you're a Catholic educator on LinkedIn, that's actually been a very valuable space for this because it can be so targeted. You can be like, I'm doing Catholic education here. I'm not doing all the other stuff. I'm just doing Catholic education. So you can find me in all those places, but makingeveryclasscatholic.com is probably the easiest and quickest way. And then it has links to all the other stuff.
Sure. That's good. We're going to put all that in the show notes. So that brings us to the end of our time. Dr. Brett Salkeld, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for being on the podcast. Thanks for stepping out and writing it and all the follow-up speaking and everything you're doing. It's just a great gift. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Brett. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Listeners, I'm sure this episode was a blessing to you, and we will see you next time.